I was in the middle of saving a heart attack patient's life, so I didn't drop everything to save my foster sister's dog. The next moment, I got a message from my fiance, Felix Collier. Felix, because you let it die and did nothing. Tiffany's dog ended up in the animal hospital. Felix, let's push back the wedding. Consider it your punishment. That was the 9th time Felix had used some manufactured crisis to push our wedding further into the horizon. The 9th time he had taken Tiffany's latest drama and turned it into a lesson I supposedly needed to learn. The 9th time he had punished me for being a doctor instead of a pet sitter. I stood in the hospital corridor with my surgical gown still damp from the emergency procedure. My hands were steady because they had to be. But my chest felt like someone had cracked it open and left it hollow. I had just spent 4 hours bringing a man back from cardiac arrest. His wife had held my arm and sobbed with relief. And now the man, who claimed to love me, was demanding I apologize for not abandoning a dying human being to rush to the aid of a dog that had eaten chocolate on purpose. This time, I was not going to play along. I had played along for 3 years. I had swallowed every accusation and smiled through every delay and convinced myself that Felix would eventually see the truth. But something inside me had finally stopped pretending. I walked back to the resident lounge on the 3rd floor. I needed to sit down before my legs gave out. The lounge was empty except for the faint hum of the coffee machine and the fluorescent light that buzzed like a trapped insect. I dropped onto the worn leather couch and I pressed my palms against my eyes. That was when I noticed the hospital phone on the side table had been left off the hook. I was about to hang it up when I heard Felix's voice crackling through the speaker. It was tinny and distorted, but unmistakable. He was on speakerphone and he did not know I was listening. The call was coming from the office line at his company. Tiffany's voice followed immediately. She said, "Felix, is she coming? Did you yell at her enough?" I heard Felix sigh, and I heard the sound of a chair creaking. He said I told her to get over here, but she's probably still sulking in that hospital of hers. Tiffany laughed that light musical laugh that I had always found charming until I realized it was the sound of someone who had never been denied anything. She said she really thinks you are going to marry her, does not she? Felix was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It does not matter what she thinks. The engagement was my grandfather's idea anyway. I never wanted it." Tiffany said so. "Why do you keep stringing her along?" Felix said, "Because I need her to stay quiet until the merger is finalized. My father's company is buying out her family's medical supply chain, and if she kicks up a public scandal right now, it could cost us $40 million. She said, "But after the merger." Felix laughed and said, "After the merger, I will deal with her. She will get a settlement and a plane ticket, and that will be the end of it." Tiffany giggled and said, "What about the wedding she keeps talking about?" Felix said there will never be a wedding. I will keep pushing it back until she gives up or until we are done with her. Either way, she's not getting what she wants. I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear, and I felt something inside me detach. It was not anger. It was not even sadness. It was the quiet click of a lock opening. 3 years. 3 years of thinking he was the only person who had ever truly seen me. 3 years of believing that if I worked hard enough and loved him enough and proved myself enough, he would finally choose me. But I was never an option to him. I was a placeholder. A temporary inconvenience he was tolerating until his business deal closed. I hung up the phone and I placed it back on its cradle. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just sat there and let the truth settle into my bones. Then I started to think about what I was going to do. The first thing I did was go back to my office and lock the door. I pulled out my laptop and I started scrolling through the hospital's internal records. I had access to everything because I was the quality and safety director. It was my job to audit medical records and flag inconsistencies. I had always been meticulous about following protocol. But today, I was looking for something specific. I found it in the electronic health records under Tiffany's name. 3 months ago, she had been admitted to our hospital for what she claimed was a severe allergic reaction. The attending physician had noted that her symptoms were inconsistent with anaphylaxis. She had no elevated tryptase levels, no hives, no airway obstruction, but the discharge summary still listed a diagnosis of idiopathic angioedema. I pulled up the original lab reports and I compared them to what had been entered into the final record. The numbers did not match. Someone had altered the results to make her look sicker than she actually was. I scrolled further and I found a consult note from a specialist who had examined Tiffany and written that she was physically healthy. That note had been omitted from the final chart. I pulled the billing records next. Tiffany's insurance had been billed for 3 additional days of hospitalization that she had never used. The charges were fraudulent. I sat back in my chair and I let out a long, slow breath. Tiffany was not just lying about her health. She was committing medical fraud. And Felix had been either complicit or willfully blind. I also found something else. A confidential memo from the hospital's legal counsel regarding a patient complaint that had been filed against me 6 months ago. The complaint alleged that I had neglected a patient and caused unnecessary suffering. I had never been notified of this complaint. I had never been asked to respond to it. But the memo showed that it had been formally registered and then quietly archived without investigation. I traced the complaint back to its source, and I found that the person who filed it had used a burner email address. But the IP address traced back to Felix's company network. He had tried to destroy my career. He had fabricated a patient complaint to put a stain on my record, probably to weaken my position in case I ever tried to fight him on anything. That was the moment I stopped being a victim. I did not confront Felix. I did not call him and scream. I started collecting evidence. I downloaded every altered lab result and every omitted consult note and every fraudulent billing entry. I saved the memo about the fabricated complaint. I also pulled the hospital's security footage from the lobby on the day Tiffany had been admitted. The footage showed her walking in without any difficulty. She was not wheezing. She was not clutching her throat. She was laughing on her phone. I saved that too. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued going through the archives. I found 3 more instances where Tiffany had been admitted for dramatic symptoms that did not match the test results. Each time the records had been altered. Each time the attending physician had written a note that contradicted the official discharge summary. Each time someone had been paid to look the other way. I traced the pattern to a single source. The hospital's chief medical officer had been receiving kickbacks from Tiffany's family in exchange for falsifying her records. The payments were routed through a shell company that was owned by Tiffany's father. I now had enough evidence to destroy everyone involved. But I did not go to the authorities yet. I needed to be sure I had everything. While I was gathering the records, I also started making my own quiet preparations. I contacted an attorney named Victoria who specialized in medical fraud and workplace retaliation. I sent her the encrypted files and she agreed to represent me. She advised me to keep my discoveries private until I was ready to act. She also told me to secure my personal documents and to prepare for a sudden departure if necessary. I did not know what that departure would look like, but I started packing anyway. One evening, Felix came home earlier than usual. He found me in the guest room sorting through a box of old papers. He leaned against the doorframe and asked me what I was doing. I told him I was organizing some files. He did not ask any follow-up questions. He never did. He was too busy being preoccupied with his own world. He said Tiffany's dog was still not eating, and he wanted me to go over and check on it. I looked at him and I said, I am a doctor, not a veterinarian. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he shrugged and walked away. That was the moment I realized he did not care about me even enough to argue. I was not even worth the effort of a proper fight anymore. A week later, I received a formal notice from the hospital's board. They were placing me on administrative leave, pending an investigation into the patient complaint that had been filed against me. The complaint that I had never been told about. The complaint that Felix had fabricated. I did not protest. I did not appeal. I just accepted the suspension and went home. When Felix found out, he was furious. He said, "How am I supposed to explain to my board that my fiance has been suspended for negligence?" I said you could try telling them the truth. He said, "What truth?" I said the truth, that the complaint was fabricated by someone who wanted to hurt my reputation. He laughed and said, "You are really going to blame everyone else for your mistakes." I did not argue. I just nodded and walked away. That night, I sent Victoria the final batch of evidence. I also sent her a letter of resignation from the hospital. I had already been accepted into a humanitarian medical program based in Antarctica. It was a 2-year posting with limited communication back to the mainland. It was the perfect way to disappear. The day before I left, I wrote a short note to Felix. I did not explain anything. I just told him that I would not be coming back. I left the note on the kitchen counter along with my engagement ring. The ring had always been too big, and I had wrapped it in medical tape to keep it from sliding off. I unwrapped the tape, and I let the ring sit bare on the counter. It looked small and unimportant without the tape. I flew out the next morning. I did not look back at the city. I did not check my phone. I did not cry. For the next 6 months, I worked at the research station in the frozen desert. The work was brutal, and the cold was relentless, but it was honest. I spent my days analyzing ice cores and monitoring atmospheric data. I slept in a bunk bed and I ate cafeteria food, and I did not think about Felix. I thought about the evidence I had collected. I thought about the lawsuit Victoria was preparing. But mostly I thought about the person I was becoming. Someone who did not need anyone else's approval. Then, the communication blackout happened. A severe storm knocked out the satellite relay, and we were cut off from the outside world for 3 weeks. When the connection was finally restored, I received a flood of messages. Most of them were from Victoria. She told me that the lawsuit had been filed. The hospital board had been forced to investigate the chief medical officer. Tiffany's fraudulent records had been exposed. And Felix's company had been dragged into the scandal because the fabricated patient complaint had been traced back to his servers. She also told me that Felix had been trying to find me. He had called every number and contacted every mutual acquaintance. He had even flown to the Antarctic departure point and demanded to know where I was. Victoria asked me if I wanted to respond. I said no. Over the next 18 months, the legal battle played out from a distance. I received updates via email, but I did not participate directly. The hospital chief medical officer was fired and lost his medical license. Tiffany was charged with insurance fraud and falsifying medical records. She received a suspended sentence and was ordered to pay restitution. Felix's company was fined heavily for its involvement in the fabricated complaint. And the chief medical officer's kickback scheme was exposed to the public. But the most interesting development was the way Felix changed. He did not just lose the lawsuit. He lost his composure entirely. He started calling the research station every week, demanding to speak to me. The station manager finally told him that I was not available and that any further calls would be considered harassment. He stopped calling after that. But he did not stop trying. He started sending packages to the station. Books and scarves and letters that I never opened. They piled up in a storage closet until the station manager finally returned them to sender. By the time my 2-year contract ended, I had become a different person. The cold had hardened my body, and the isolation had sharpened my mind. I was ready to go back into the world. I did not go back to the city where Felix lived. I went to Geneva to take a position with the World Health Organization. I had been offered a role as a regional health safety coordinator. It was a prestigious job, and it gave me the platform I needed to push for better medical record transparency worldwide. A year later, I was invited to speak at the Global Health Summit in Vienna. It was the largest gathering of medical professionals and policymakers in the world. I was scheduled to give the opening keynote on the importance of accountability in healthcare administration. I flew into Vienna 2 days before the summit. I checked into the hotel and I went over my presentation notes. I felt calm and centered and ready. On the morning of the summit, I walked into the main hall and I saw him. Felix was sitting in the 3rd row of the VIP section. He was wearing a suit that was too sharp for a medical conference. He looked thinner than before, and there was a hollow quality to his eyes that I did not remember. He was not there to learn about healthcare policy. He was there to find me. I did not react. I walked up to the podium and I started my speech. I talked about the gaps in medical oversight and the ways that fraudulent records can harm patients. I talked about the importance of whistleblower protections. I talked about the need for independent auditing of hospital administrations. I did not look at Felix even once. After the speech, I was surrounded by delegates. They asked questions and took photos and exchanged business cards. I answered everything with the calm professionalism I had perfected. When the crowd finally thinned, I saw Felix approaching from the side of the room. He looked smaller, up close. He walked toward me with his hands slightly raised like he was approaching a wild animal. He said Nara. I said Mr. Collier. He flinched like I had slapped him. He said, please. He said, please just let me talk to you for 5 minutes. I said, I have no reason to speak to you. He said, I know what I did. I know I was a coward and a liar. I know I let Tiffany manipulate me into treating you terribly. I know about the complaint. I should never have allowed that. I know I said horrible things about our engagement and about you. I know I was blind and stupid, and I've spent the last 2 years trying to find you because I need to tell you that I have changed. I said, Mr. Collier, I have no interest in your transformation. He said, please. He said, I loved you. I said you loved what I could do for you. You loved the convenience of having someone who was too loyal to leave. You loved the power of holding the wedding over my head. That is not love. That is ownership. And I am not your possession anymore. I turned to walk away. He reached out and touched my arm. I stopped and I looked at his hand on my sleeve. I said, remove your hand or I will call security. He let go immediately. He said, can you at least forgive me? I said, forgiveness requires change. And change requires accountability. Have you publicly admitted that you fabricated that complaint? Have you compensated me for the damage to my career? Have you made any actual amends beyond coming here to ask for my time? He was silent. I said, that is what I thought. I walked away, and this time he did not follow. The next day I flew back to Geneva. I received an email from Victoria saying that Felix had been seen at the local courthouse filing a formal declaration acknowledging his role in the fabricated complaint. He had not been required to do that. He had done it voluntarily. Victoria asked me if I wanted to respond. I said no. A month later, I received a letter from Felix's attorney. It contained a settlement offer. Felix was offering to pay restitution for the career damage I had sustained. The amount was substantial. I accepted it through Victoria, and I never spoke to him directly. 2 years after the summit, I was promoted to director of the WHO's Medical Integrity Division. I traveled too. Conferences and conducted investigations and worked with governments to tighten their healthcare regulations. I was good at my job because I knew exactly how the system could be abused. I had seen it up close. I also started a private foundation focused on supporting whistleblowers in the medical field. I knew how hard it was to speak up when you were afraid of losing everything. I wanted to make it easier for others to do what I had done. One evening, I was sitting in my apartment in Geneva looking out at the lake. The lights of the city reflected off the water, and the mountains loomed in the distance. I thought about the girl who had sat on that hospital couch 3 years ago, listening to her fiance plot her dismissal. I thought about the fear and the humiliation and the desperate hope that he would eventually choose me. That girl was gone. She had been replaced by someone who trusted her own judgment. Someone who did not need anyone else to validate her existence. I opened my laptop and I looked at the files Victoria had sent me years ago. I did not need them anymore. I had moved on, but I kept them as a reminder of where I had been. I closed the laptop and I took a sip of my tea. The phone on the table buzzed with a message from Victoria. She said Felix Collier had been admitted to a psychiatric facility. The stress of the legal battles and the public scandal had finally broken him. His family had taken control of the company, and he was being treated for severe depression. I read the message and I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No pity. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the person I had once loved was now a stranger. I deleted the message and I went to bed. The next morning, I woke up early and went to the office. I had a meeting with a delegation from Southeast Asia about improving hospital transparency. It was going to be a long day, but it was going to be a good day, because it was mine. But I knew that was not the end of the story. Not really. The legal aftermath kept unfolding for another year. Tiffany's father was investigated for tax evasion related to the shell company. He was ultimately sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Tiffany herself tried to flee the country but was stopped at the airport. Her suspended sentence was revoked, and she served 6 months in county jail. I read about all of this in the news. I did not follow it closely, but the headlines found their way to me. The hospital where I had worked underwent a complete administrative overhaul. The chief medical officer was permanently barred from practicing medicine. Several other staff members were fired. And the board implemented new protocols for record keeping and patient complaint handling. I was offered my old job back with a promotion and a significant raise. I declined. I had no interest in returning to that place or that city. Instead, I focused on my work at the WHO. I traveled to remote regions to assess healthcare infrastructure. I met with ministers and hospital administrators and patient advocacy groups. I developed training materials for ethical medical documentation. I published papers on fraud detection in healthcare systems. My reputation grew, and I was invited to join advisory boards for several international medical ethics organizations. I also started mentoring young doctors who wanted to enter public health policy. I remembered how alone I felt when I was navigating the betrayal and the legal battles. I wanted to be the person I had needed back then. One of my mentees was a woman named Elena who had faced a similar situation in her own country. She had been blacklisted by her hospital for reporting corruption. I helped her find a new position, and I testified on her behalf before a human rights tribunal. She later told me that my example had given her the courage to fight back. That meant more to me than any professional achievement. 3 years after the Geneva summit, I received a letter from Felix. It was handwritten and it was long. He wrote that he had been discharged from the psychiatric facility. He was living in a small coastal town and working as a volunteer at a local clinic. He had renounced his position in the family company and was trying to rebuild his life from scratch. He said he had spent every day of the past 3 years thinking about what he had done to me. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for another chance. He simply wanted to tell me that he understood now. He understood that love was not about convenience or leverage. He understood that trust was not something you could restore with words alone. He said he was sorry, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to be a better person even if I never knew about it. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer with other old documents. I did not respond to it. I did not feel the need to. His journey was his own now. Mine was separate. A few months. Later, I was invited to give a keynote address at a conference on healthcare leadership in Singapore. I spoke about the importance of psychological safety in medical workplaces. I talked about how fear and silence allowed systemic abuse to flourish. I shared anonymized examples from my own experience. I did not name names or reveal specific details. But I spoke with the authority of someone who had survived and thrived. After the conference, a woman approached me in the lobby. She looked familiar, but I could not immediately place her. She introduced herself as one of the nurses who had worked alongside me at the hospital years ago. She told me that my departure had inspired her to speak up about other irregularities she had witnessed. She said she had filed a whistleblower complaint and had been protected by the new protocols. She thanked me for paving the way. I did not know what to say. I had never thought of myself as a pioneer. I had just done what I needed to do to survive. But hearing her words made me realize that my actions had rippled outward in ways I had not anticipated. That night, I sat on the balcony of my hotel room, looking at the glittering skyline. I thought about all the small decisions that had led me here. The decision to hang up that phone. The decision to collect evidence instead of screaming. The decision to leave without looking back. The decision to keep moving forward even when I was afraid. Each decision had been a step away from the person I had been and toward the person I was becoming. I did not regret any of it. Not the pain. Not the loneliness. Not the years of silence. Because all of it had been necessary. All of it had been part of the journey. I took out my notebook and I started writing down ideas for a new initiative I wanted to launch. It would be a global network of medical professionals who could support each other in reporting misconduct. I wanted to create a confidential platform where people could share their experiences and find legal and emotional resources. I had the contacts and the credibility to make it happen. I started sketching out the framework. The next morning, I flew back to Geneva. I went straight to the office and I started working on the proposal. It took me 6 months to secure funding and another 3 months to build the infrastructure. But eventually, the network launched with chapters in 15 countries. It grew slowly and steadily, and within 2 years, it had helped hundreds of doctors and nurses. I looked back at that first day in the hospital lounge, and I realized how far I had come. The woman who had collapsed onto that leather couch with her heart in pieces was a stranger to me now. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. I had not just survived. I had flourished. I did not need Felix's apology or his redemption. I did not need Tiffany's downfall or her suffering. I did not need anyone to validate my existence. I had built a life that was meaningful and whole and entirely my own. And that was the only victory that mattered. I still think about the dog sometimes. Not with bitterness. Just with a kind of detached curiosity. That animal had been used as a pawn in a game I never wanted to play. But the game was over now. And I had walked away with my head held high. The scar on my arm from where the IV had been inserted during the forced blood draw had faded to a faint white line. I did not cover it up. I wore short sleeves and I let it show. It was a reminder of what I had endured and what I had overcome. On the anniversary of the day, I left Felix I, took a walk along the lake in Geneva. The water was calm and the mountains were capped with snow. I stopped at a bench and I sat down and I watched the swans glide across the surface. I thought about the girl who had run to the hospital lounge 3 years ago. I thought about the phone and the words she had heard. I thought about the ring she had left on the counter. And I smiled. That girl was gone. But she had not been destroyed. She had been transformed. I stood up and I continued walking. The path stretched ahead of me, and the sun was warm on my face. I had no idea what the next decade would bring. But I was not afraid. I had faced the worst, and I had come through it. I had learned that the only person I truly needed was myself. And that was enough. I kept walking until the bench was out of sight. Then I turned toward home. My home. The one I had built with my own hands and my own heart. And I was grateful for every step of the journey.